Hello and welcome to another examination of a case that appears in the book Missing 411, Western United States and Canada by the author David Paulides. In that book, Paulides states that this particular case is in his top 10 most mysterious cases that he has ever researched. I'd like you to keep that in mind as you listen to Garrett's case, and by the end, I'd like you to comment if you agree that this is one of the strangest cases of a child going missing that you've ever heard. My personal opinion on the matter will be made very clear. Today, I will present the case based on facts from my public records request return that I received from the Summit County Sheriff, supplemented in part by newspapers. You may notice that as I show articles on screen, or if you check out the newspapers yourself, some of the information that I present conflicts with what's in the news articles. This is because the information that I received from the sheriff's office will always trump newspapers. And, of course, you can see the public records return for yourself for free on my Patreon page. Speaking of sources, you can find my sources linked in the description box below, as always. Feel free to check up on me and make sure that I'm presenting the story in an unbiased way. Without further ado, let's get into the case of Garrett Bardsley. Garrett Bardsley was born into a highly religious family, with parents Kevin and Heidi. He had 3 other siblings, and the family was always busy with school, church, and extracurricular activities such as Boy Scouts and sports. Garrett's father would describe him as full of innocence and without any hardness of the world. A friend recounted a tale of Garrett encountering a bear during a camping trip, and although the experience was scary at the time, he excitedly returned to camp to tell others about it, and they set out looking for the bear again as a group, eager to demonstrate how brave they all were. His mother spoke in an interview about how Garrett would always find the finer details in life that others never took the time or care to notice. His father echoed this sentiment, recalling when Garrett had pointed out how soft the nose of a horse was. He would always manage to find something that he thought was wonderful in things that others would take for granted as mundane. He was a stubborn child, but in a good way. That is to say, he had struggles in life that he refused to let get him down. For example, he had problems reading, but rather than avoid the challenge, he would actively seek out more opportunities to improve. He wasn't embarrassed by his shortcomings. He accepted those parts of himself and wanted to improve them, to turn his weaknesses into strengths. The Cubrent Lakes Trail is considered a moderately challenging hike to make. The terrain is rocky, contains many water features, and is largely forested. The Boy Scout campsite that Garrett's scout troop made, according to the search and rescue maps that I received from the Summit County Sheriff's Office, was near the western base of Mount Marcel. This is just south of Cubrent Lake, but there are many smaller, unnamed lakes in this area that, for the sake of navigation, are simply referred to as Cubrent Lakes numbers 1 through 4. The lake that we're interested in is Cubrent Lake number 3, which is to the northwest of the campsite, and does appear to have a very small trail that leads just about from the camp to the lake. Although I couldn't see the trail on satellite images and it's not marked on Google Maps. The only reason why I think there may be a small trail at all is on this page from alltrails.com that has it marked. I only mention this as it will arise later. On Friday, August 20th, 2004, Garrett was with his father on a Boy Scout outing. This means that, in addition to being just around his father, the campsite that they were at were filled with boys Garrett's age as well as other scout leadership. That morning, while dew on the ground was still fresh, Garrett and his father, Kevin, went to a nearby Cubrent Lake to fish. Importantly, this was not the main Cubrent Lake, but one of the smaller lakes that had the same name. This particular lake was just shy of 400 yards to the northwest of camp that the Boy Scouts established. The fishing at that spot appears to have been on the north or west side of the lake, adding about another 100 yards as the crow flies. If we just look at the maps provided by the sheriff, there does not appear to be an established trail between this lake and the campsite. My guess, based on the All Trails map that I mentioned earlier, and from other sources that I've read, is that there are game trails and small walking paths that might go in that direction, but honestly, that's just a guess. If anyone has been there before, I'd love to hear what the exact topography is like. In any case, the fishing spot the two set up would have added about 200 yards of hiking off of any sort of trail. A short time after arriving at the lake, the two began to fish. Garrett, in the course of his fishing, slipped and got his feet wet in the lake. At about 8 in the morning, uncomfortable with his wet socks, especially considering his ingrown toenails on both feet and the cold weather, Garrett decided that he was going to make a quick trip back to camp in order to change out of his socks and shoes for dry ones. His father thought that his 12-year-old Boy Scout could make the trip on his own, so he opted to remain at the lake and continue fishing. In a later interview with the press, Kevin recounts his last exchange with his son. Garrett started to get off course a little bit. Bardsley said he yelled at the boy to get back on the trail, and then watched him go off into the trees. About 20 minutes later, Garrett had still not returned. Getting a little concerned, Kevin decided that he would head back to camp to see what was taking so long. When he arrived, he inquired if anyone had seen Garrett. Nobody had, which meant that Garrett had likely never made it back from the lake. Panicked, Kevin returned to the lake, calling Garrett's name along the way. To his dismay, there was no answer, nor any sign of Garrett. Kevin returned to the camp and let the adults know what was happening. The scout leaders organized search parties to look for Garrett, and as time went by without finding him, one of them mounted up on a mule and rode to the nearest ranger station for help. It was just before 11 in the morning, about 3 hours after Garrett had last been seen, when the missing person report finally made it to the Summit County Sheriff Dispatch. Deputy Jim Snyder took the call, but he noted that the details were very sparse, and at this point, he was not aware of the severity of the issue. He drove out to the area and met with the scout leader, who apprised him of the situation. Realizing that this was indeed an emergency and that Garrett had still not been found, he radioed for search and rescue to come out and begin looking. While he waited for them, he filled out the necessary paperwork and planned the search effort that he would be taking charge of. Deputy Snyder split the search and rescue members into several groups. He sent 3 teams to cover the established trail exits at Holiday Park, Bald Mountain, and Lake Trail, just in case Garrett had managed to wander his way out of the woods and ended up following an established trail. He then sent the remainder, including horseback riders, to the search area where Garrett had last been seen. The search would be extremely difficult, described by a dog team leader as the most difficult area they've ever had to search. The rescue effort was well equipped and had access to helicopter support, which was capable of searching with infrared and night vision. So, as the sun set and the ground effort stopped for the evening, the air searching continued late into the night. The search went on like this for about 10 days before it was decided that search and rescue teams needed to scale back the efforts so that they could be responsive to any new issues that arose. As you can see from this map, the search was quite extensive, and although it had been scaled back, the search would continue every Friday for at least the next month. In October of 2006, a hunter found a shoe that seemed to match the description of what Garrett was thought to have on when he disappeared. The shoe was noted to be 10.5 inches long, which I believe is too large for Garrett, as he had size 6 or 7 shoes, but they took the shoe to the Bardsley family for identification. I don't see an update concerning the shoe, so I'm not sure if it was positively identified or not. In 2016, there was a little more movement on the case. I see several redacted interviews taking place with individuals who may have been present at the time of Garrett's disappearance. However, the entirety of the conversation is redacted, so I don't know what took place there. Garrett Bardsley is still a missing person as of the writing of this script. There were other disappearances of Boy Scouts around this time that are referenced in newspaper articles. This led to the Boy Scouts as an organization to be scrutinized by the public concerning safety practices. In fact, about half the articles that I read were mostly about this more political and organizational angle rather than details around Garrett specifically. The leadership protested that if all of their safety protocols were followed, that there would never be any problems. They back this up with some statistics about how many total treks there are compared to the number of missing scouts, and then go on to make a little bit of a backhanded statement about Garrett's father, saying that they can't control what a parent chooses to do or allows their child to do, referencing how Kevin allowed Garrett to go alone without gear and off trail to camp, which violated a number of their established rules. That said, being a former scout member myself, I can tell you that it is exceedingly common for boys to be on their own and not be carrying the survival items noted in the article, regardless of what scout leaders would have you believe. While I personally think that Garrett's case is exceptional in the terms of the sheer hubris of his father to say that all Boy Scouts are watched all the time and expect children of that age group to follow all of the rules without supervision is just absurd. One positive note for this case is that, despite Garrett never being found, his family has gotten very involved into volunteer search and rescue efforts. They put together the Garrett Bardsley Foundation, which aims to provide help to anyone who gets lost in the wilds of Utah. This, however, would not last forever, and the foundation appears to have ceased operation as of October of 2019. Something that stood out to me in this case is how readily Garrett's parents accepted his death. Heidi, Garrett's mother, recalled how when she first got the news from Kevin that Garrett had gone missing, she said that she knew immediately he was gone forever. Kevin also accepted this reality very quickly in comparison to other cases that we've covered, breaking the mold of parents insisting on kidnapping theories and instead going heavily in the opposite direction. Their religious views seem to have allowed them to pull a lot of positive energy out of what I would describe as an unequivocally tragic event. For example, the couple recall how, during the search for Garrett, a scout suddenly had a medical crisis and was able to be airlifted to a hospital because the helicopter was already in the area to look for Garrett. They went on to say, quote, "We know of at least 2 scouts that Garrett has saved," close quote. I just want to make it clear that I am happy that the family was able to lean on their religion for comfort and that they were able to see some of the good coming out of an otherwise horrible situation. But then there are some comments that were made, such as, quote, "So many people's lives were touched by Garrett, more than if he had lived to be 80 years old." Comments like that come off to me personally as almost a little bit creepy and frankly uncaring for the dead child. I'm sure that I'm just reading too much into it. And to be clear, I don't think that there was anything untoward happening in this case, but I just wanted to mention that as some of those statements just really hit me in the wrong way, especially given who I personally hold at fault for the whole situation. When I read those comments, I struggle to see it as a positive spin for the sake of actual good to come of it. Rather, I see it as somebody who is desperately trying to excuse the inexcusable. But let me know if you think I'm being too jaded. If you're familiar with the case from Missing 411, you'll notice that there are some rather conspicuous differences. Let's go over some of those. I'm going to move rather quickly because there's a point at the end that I would like to make, and I want as many people as possible to stick around to hear it. So please just bear with me, or at least just skip over this point to the end so that you can hear my final thoughts. There was a gap of about 3 hours before the sheriff was contacted, rather than the immediately described in the book, with a larger time lag for when the search and rescue team actually arrived. In the book, we read this on page 206, quote, "Kevin watched as Garrett walked the correct path back to camp until he lost sight of him in the trees." From an interview with Kevin in the park record that I've already referenced, we get the information, quote, "Garrett started to get off course a little bit. Bardsley said that he yelled at the boy to get him back on the trail, and then I watched him go off into the trees." By cutting the information that Garrett went off track almost immediately, we lose the obvious sense that Garrett was not sure about what path to follow, unlike how it was described in Missing 411. You may have noticed that the book describes one of Garrett's socks as being found in a boulder field during the search, and I didn't mention that at all in this video. That's because, as far as I can tell, the sock found did not belong to Garrett and is not relevant to this case, which is a real shame considering that Paulides makes a big deal out of boulder involvement. The distance to the lake is not only far greater than the 200 yards in the book, but there's also not a truly established trail that I can see from the majority of maps. The description given by Paulides makes it sound like he thinks Garrett went missing from the largest Cubrant lake, but that's not the case, and even if it was, the distance would be greater from the lake to the camp. I can't blame Paulides entirely for the distance issue, though, as I don't see any newspaper that had the correct distance. The distance seemed to get smaller and smaller with each subsequent article, with some quoting as little as 100 yards. Paulides says that he can't request records from the sheriff as they are not bound by the Freedom of Information Act. While this is technically true, most law enforcement agencies do still have a public records request that you can make. And this has nearly the same process as a Freedom of Information Act request. In fact, it's easier, I think, in most cases. And it's so similar, in fact, that I've accidentally been using the terms interchangeably in my videos prior to this one. So sure, while I had to pay for this records request, it was fulfilled and I had no trouble requesting the information. Lastly, I want to highlight some victim blaming, for lack of a better word, that takes place in the book. Granted, Paulides means the comment not as a shot at Garrett, but rather to highlight the strangeness of the case. I will read the quote directly from page 207 so you can see what I mean. Quote, "It's hard to understand how anyone Garrett's age could have been lost when you look at a geological survey map of the region." Close quote. In other words, Garrett was too experienced and capable of a 12-year-old to possibly have gone missing from here. It would have taken, a real idiot. Well, let's hear from Randy Taylor, a volunteer at the U.S. Forestry Service, a private pilot, and an experienced hunter regarding a hunting trip to this same area. Quote, "I couldn't find my own camp, even though I knew it was just 200 or 300 yards away. I never get lost. I enjoy going into areas where I've never been before with a map and a compass and finding my way out. But I couldn't find my camp." Close quote. All right, now here's the point I want everyone watching this video, whether you agree with my points or not, to understand and internalize. It is not strange at all that Garrett got lost. Additionally, it is not his fault for going missing. He could not, or rather should not, have been expected to perform a task like navigating nearly 500 yards of unfamiliar, unmarked, difficult terrain alone, especially without any survival or navigation gear. This is going to sound insensitive, but the fact remains. If Garrett's father had simply put down the fishing pole and accompanied his child back to camp, we may not be here today discussing this case. So, what do you think? Is this one of the strangest unexplained disappearances that you've ever heard? Or is your opinion more aligned with mine? Is this a 12-year-old who got lost in the woods when he was tasked with traveling 500 yards alone without large marked trails? Let me know your thoughts. Finally, thanks for watching until the end. Hit like if you liked the video, and if you disliked, well, I'm impressed you're still here. A special thanks goes out to my patrons over on Patreon for making my job a little easier. Until next time, take care.